The gunshot echoed across the dusty plains of Montana Territory in 1876, drawing Garrett Hayes' attention away from the cattle he'd been driving toward the ranch. His hand instinctively moved to the revolver at his hip, eyes scanning the horizon as he pulled his sorrel horse to a halt. The second shot came from the direction of the Lawson homestead, and without hesitation, Garrett dug his heels into his horse's flanks, racing toward the sound. The Lawson place came into view, a modest cabin with a small barn beside it. Another shot rang out, followed by the distant sound of hoofbeats retreating. Garrett pushed his horse harder, dust billowing behind him as he approached the homestead. He found Thomas Lawson lying in the dirt outside his cabin, blood soaking through his shirt. The older man was still breathing, but barely. Garrett dismounted in a fluid motion, kneeling beside his neighbor and friend. "Thomas, who did this?" Garrett asked, pressing his bandana against the wound in the man's chest. Thomas's weathered face contorted in pain. "Claim jumpers. Wanted my land, my gold." His breathing was labored, each word a struggle. "Garrett, my daughter, Lillian's coming home from back east." "Save your strength," Garrett urged, looking toward the cabin for anything that might help. Thomas grabbed Garrett's arm with surprising strength. "Promise me you'll look after her. She doesn't know about the West. She needs protection." Garrett nodded solemnly. "I promise, Thomas, I'll watch over her." Relief washed over Thomas's face. "She arrives, Silver Creek, 3 days, letter inside." His grip loosened, eyes fixed on the vast Montana sky. "Thank you, old friend." With those words, Thomas Lawson took his final breath, leaving Garrett with a solemn oath and the weight of responsibility. After burying Thomas on the hill behind the cabin, Garrett gathered the few personal items from inside, including the letter Thomas had mentioned. Lillian Lawson would arrive by stagecoach in Silver Creek in 3 days, unaware that she was now an orphan with nothing but a small homestead to her name and a stranger who had promised to protect her. Garrett rode back to his own ranch, his mind troubled. He had his own battles to fight, his own ranch to maintain. The last thing he needed was to look after some city girl who knew nothing about survival in Montana Territory. But a promise was a promise, especially one made to a dying man. The next morning, Garrett rode into Silver Creek, the closest town to both his and Thomas's properties. He needed to inform Sheriff Miller about Thomas's murder and see if the lawman had any leads on the claim jumpers. Silver Creek was a growing settlement, boasting a general store, a saloon, a small hotel, and various other establishments catering to the needs of ranchers, miners, and travelers passing through. Garrett hitched his horse outside the sheriff's office and stepped inside. Sheriff Miller was a stout man with a gray mustache and a no-nonsense attitude. He looked up from his desk as Garrett entered. "Hayes," he acknowledged with a nod. "What brings you to town?" "Thomas Lawson was murdered yesterday," Garrett said without preamble. "Shot by claim jumpers on his property." The sheriff's expression darkened. "Damn, Thomas was a good man." He reached for his hat. "I'll ride out there today, see if I can pick up any tracks." "Already buried him," Garrett said. "Behind his cabin, but there's something else. His daughter is arriving from back east in a couple of days. She doesn't know yet." Miller rubbed his chin thoughtfully. "Lillian, right? He mentioned she was finishing school in Boston." Garrett nodded. "I promised Thomas I'd look after her." A hint of amusement crossed Miller's face. "You looking after a city girl?" "I gave my word," Garrett replied stiffly. "Well, good luck with that." The sheriff stood, reaching for his gun belt. "I'll ask around, see if anyone's noticed strangers in the area. Those claim jumpers might still be nearby, especially if they think there's gold on Lawson's land." "Is there?" Garrett asked. Thomas had never mentioned gold to him. Miller shrugged. "There have been rumors, small strikes in the hills behind his property. Nothing substantial confirmed, but enough to attract attention." Garrett frowned. If those rumors were true, Lillian Lawson might be in even more danger than he'd anticipated. "I'll be at the stage depot when she arrives," Garrett said. "Figured I'd bring her to my place first, break the news, then take her to her father's cabin when she's ready." "Wise decision," Miller agreed. "I'll let you know if I find anything about those killers." 2 days later, Garrett found himself standing at the Silver Creek Stage Depot, hat in hand, waiting for the Boston-educated daughter of his deceased neighbor. He had no idea what to expect. Would she be prim and proper, haughty and entitled, soft and useless? Whatever the case, he had made a promise, and Garrett Hayes was a man of his word. The stagecoach rolled into town in a cloud of dust, the driver pulling the team of horses to a stop in front of the depot. Garrett watched as the door opened and passengers began to disembark. The first was an older gentleman in a business suit, followed by a young couple. And then she appeared. Lillian Lawson stepped down from the stagecoach with grace, despite the long journey. She wore a traveling dress of deep blue that complemented her fair complexion and honey blonde hair, which was pinned neatly beneath a modest hat. She wasn't what Garrett had expected. There was a quiet dignity about her, a self-assurance that didn't cross into arrogance. She looked around expectantly, clearly searching for her father. Garrett took a deep breath and approached her. "Miss Lawson," he said, placing his hat back on his head. She turned to him, green eyes curious. "Yes, my name is Garrett Hayes. I'm a neighbor of your father's." He paused, struggling to find the right words. "I'm afraid I have some difficult news." Understanding dawned in her eyes, followed quickly by dread. "My father, is he ill?" Garrett shook his head solemnly. "I'm sorry to tell you that your father passed away 2 days ago. He was shot by claimed jumpers on his property." The color drained from her face, and for a moment Garrett thought she might faint, but Lillian Lawson surprised him. She took a shaky breath, squared her shoulders, and met his gaze. "I see," she said, her voice barely above a whisper. "And the men who did this? Sheriff Miller is investigating. No sign of them yet." She nodded, processing this information with remarkable composure. "I would like to see my father's, where he is buried." "Of course," Garrett replied, "but it's a few hours' ride." "I thought you might want to rest first. I've prepared a room at my ranch. We can ride to your father's place tomorrow." Suspicion flashed in her eyes. "You're very kind, Mr. Hayes, but I don't know you. Why would you do this?" Garrett met her gaze steadily. "I was with your father when he died. He asked me to look after you, and I gave him my word." Something in his tone must have convinced her, because after a moment she nodded. "Thank you, Mr. Hayes. I accept your hospitality for tonight." Garrett helped load her trunk onto his wagon, which he'd brought instead of riding horseback, anticipating her luggage. As they prepared to leave, Sheriff Miller approached. "Miss Lawson," he said, touching the brim of his hat respectfully. "I'm Sheriff Miller. I want to express my condolences about your father. He was well respected in these parts." "Thank you, Sheriff," Lillian replied. "Have you found any trace of the men who killed him?" Miller shook his head. "Not yet, madam, but I'm pursuing every lead. Garrett here is doing right by you. He's a good man. Your father trusted him." This seemed to reassure her somewhat. After a few more words with the sheriff, Garrett helped Lillian onto the wagon seat and they set off for his ranch. The journey was mostly silent. Garrett wasn't one for idle conversation, and Lillian seemed lost in her thoughts. Occasionally, she would ask a question about the landscape or local wildlife, and he would answer as best he could. "My father wrote about his homestead," she said eventually. "He said it was beautiful here." "It is," Garrett agreed, "especially in spring when the wildflowers bloom. Your father loved this land." A tear slipped down her cheek, which she quickly wiped away. "He left Boston when I was 12 after my mother died. He visited twice, but I haven't seen him in nearly 3 years." Garrett didn't know what to say to that, so he remained silent. "He wanted me to finish my education before joining him," she continued. "I just graduated from teaching college. I was going to help establish a school here." This surprised Garrett. Silver Creek could use a school, he admitted. "Nearest one's in Helena, too far for most children around here." A ghost of a smile touched her lips. "Then perhaps I can still fulfill that dream," in his memory. Garrett's ranch came into view as they crested a hill, a substantial log house with a large barn and several corrals. Cattle grazed on the surrounding grasslands, and the mountains rose majestically in the distance. "It's lovely," Lillian commented. "It's home," Garrett replied simply, guiding the wagon toward the house. His foreman, Hank Gibbs, came out to meet them, curiosity evident on his weathered face. Garrett made brief introductions, explaining that Lillian would be staying the night. Hank expressed his condolences about Thomas before taking the wagon to unload Lillian's trunk. "This way," Garrett said, leading her into the house. The interior was surprisingly comfortable, with solid furniture and a few touches that suggested it wasn't solely a bachelor's residence. Noting her observation, Garrett explained, "My mother lived here until she passed last year. She had a way of making a place feel like home." "I'm sorry for your loss," Lillian said sincerely. Garrett nodded in acknowledgement. "Your room is upstairs, first door on the right. My housekeeper, Mrs. Potts, left some water for washing up. Dinner will be ready in about an hour." "Thank you, Mr. Hayes." "Garrett," he corrected. "If we're going to be neighbors, might as well use first names." "Then you must call me Lillian," she replied with a small smile. After showing her to her room, Garrett went outside to help Hank with the evening chores. His mind kept returning to the woman upstairs, grieving for a father she'd barely known in recent years. He had expected to feel burdened by his promise to Thomas, but instead, he found himself genuinely concerned for Lillian's well-being. Dinner was a simple but hearty affair prepared by Mrs. Potts, who lived in a small cabin on the property. The elderly woman had fussed over Lillian, clucking sympathetically about her situation and insisting she eat more to keep up her strength. "Your father's homestead is about 5 miles east of here," Garrett explained as they ate. "It's smaller than this place, but the cabin is solid. He built it himself." "Did he have any livestock?" Lillian asked. "A few horses, some chickens, a milk cow," Garrett replied. "I've been looking after them since. Well, they're doing fine." "That's very kind of you." Garrett shifted uncomfortably under her grateful gaze. "It's what neighbors do out here. Still, I appreciate it." She hesitated. "Mr. Hayes, Garrett, I should tell you that I don't expect you to fulfill your promise to my father indefinitely. Once I'm settled, I can manage on my own." Garrett studied her thoughtfully. She seemed determined, but the West was no place for a woman alone. "Let's take things one day at a time," he suggested diplomatically. After dinner, Lillian excused herself, the exhaustion of travel and grief evident in her face. Garrett remained at the table, nursing a cup of coffee and contemplating the strange turn his life had taken. The next morning, they set out for the Lawson homestead after breakfast. Lillian had changed into a simpler dress more suited for riding, and Garrett provided a gentle mare for her to ride. He was pleasantly surprised to discover she was an accomplished horsewoman. "My father insisted I learn," she explained when he commented on it. "He said a proper Westerner needs to ride." They reached the Lawson property by mid-morning. The cabin stood much as Garrett had left it, though already showing signs of neglect without its owner's care. Lillian dismounted slowly, taking in her father's home with a mixture of curiosity and sorrow. "Would you like to see inside first, or?" Garrett trailed off, uncertain. "I'd like to pay my respects to my father," she replied quietly. Garrett nodded and led her to the small hill behind the cabin where he had buried Thomas. The grave was marked with a simple wooden cross bearing Thomas's name and the date of his death. Lillian stood before it silently, tears streaming down her face. After a moment, she sank to her knees and placed a hand on the freshly turned earth. "I'm sorry I didn't get here in time, Papa," she whispered. Garrett stepped away to give her privacy, leading the horses to the small corral and checking on Thomas's animals. Everything was in order, though the cabin would need some attention if Lillian intended to live there. When he returned to the gravesite, Lillian was standing again, her face composed despite the redness around her eyes. "Thank you for burying him properly," she said, "and for marking his grave." "He was my friend," Garrett replied simply. They walked to the cabin together. Inside, it was modest but functional, with a main room that served as kitchen and living area and 2 small bedrooms. Thomas had prepared for his daughter's arrival. One of the bedrooms had a quilted bedspread and curtains that looked newer than the rest of the furnishings. "He was looking forward to your coming," Garrett said, noting her wistful expression as she touched the quilt. "I should have come sooner," she murmured. "You were doing what he wanted, getting your education." Lillian nodded absently, moving through the cabin and familiarizing herself with her new home. She paused at a small desk where Thomas had kept his papers. "Did my father mention anything about valuable minerals on his land?" she asked suddenly. Garrett tensed. The men who killed him mentioned gold, and Sheriff Miller said there have been rumors of small strikes in these hills. Did your father tell you anything in his letters? Not directly. But in his last letter, he hinted that he had found something that would secure my future. She frowned. I assumed he meant the homestead itself. If there is gold here, it could explain why those men came after him, Garrett said grimly. And they might return if they think there's more to be found. Fear flashed across Lillian's face before she mastered it. Then I suppose I'll need to be vigilant. You shouldn't stay here alone, Garrett said firmly. Not until those men are caught. I can't impose on you indefinitely, Mr. Hayes. It's not an imposition, it's common sense. He ran a hand through his hair in frustration. Look, there's a small cabin on my property where Mrs. Potts used to live before she moved into the main house with my mother. You could stay there. It would give you some independence but keep you within shouting distance if trouble comes. Lillian considered this. That's very generous. But what about my father's animals, his land? I can help you look after things here during the day, and I have hands who can check on the property regularly. She seemed torn, clearly wanting to honor her father by taking care of his homestead, but also aware of the very real danger. At least until the sheriff catches those men, Garrett added. Finally, she nodded. Very well, I accept your offer temporarily. They spent the rest of the day at the Lawson property, with Garrett showing Lillian what needed attention and helping her gather personal items she wanted to take with her. By late afternoon, they were ready to return to Garrett's ranch, Lillian's additional belongings packed in saddlebags. As they prepared to leave, Lillian took one last look at the cabin. I will be back, she said, as if making a promise to the property itself and to her father's memory. The following weeks established a routine. Lillian settled into the small cabin on Garrett's property, which she quickly made comfortable with her few possessions, and some items borrowed from the main house. Each day, Garrett or one of his ranch hands would accompany her to her father's homestead, where she tended the garden, cared for the animals, and slowly made the cabin more her own. In town, Sheriff Miller continued his investigation into Thomas's murder, but the claim jumpers seemed to have vanished. This did little to ease Garrett's concern. In his experience, men who killed for gold rarely gave up so easily. Lillian, meanwhile, approached Silver Creek's town council about establishing a school. To her delight, they were enthusiastic, offering the use of an empty building near the center of town. Several families immediately expressed interest in enrolling their children. They've asked me to start at the beginning of September, she told Garrett excitedly one evening as they shared dinner at the main house, which had become a weekly tradition. That gives me a month to prepare the schoolroom and develop my lessons. Garrett found himself smiling at her enthusiasm. The children around here could use some proper education. And what about you, Mr. Hayes? She teased. Could your education use some improvement? I can read, write, and cipher well enough to run my ranch, he replied with a hint of defensiveness. I meant no offense, Lillian said quickly. I only thought. Well, there will be evening classes for adults as well. Many have expressed interest. Garrett's expression softened. No offense taken, and I'm glad folks are interested. This territory will be applying for statehood one day and will need educated citizens. As July turned to August, the days grew hotter, and the threat of the claim jumpers began to feel more distant. Lillian spent more time at her father's homestead, sometimes staying overnight despite Garrett's concerns. She was determined to maintain her independence, a trait that both frustrated and impressed him. One such evening, Garrett found himself riding toward the Lawson place, a sense of unease driving him to check on Lillian. He told himself it was just his promise to Thomas motivating him, but deep down, he knew it was more than that. Over the weeks, his admiration for Lillian had grown into something deeper, something he wasn't ready to acknowledge, even to himself. As he approached the cabin, he noticed smoke rising from the chimney and light shining through the windows. The scene looked peaceful enough, but something felt wrong. Garrett dismounted a short distance away, tethered his horse, and approached on foot, his hand resting on his revolver. A movement near the barn caught his attention. A figure slipped from shadow to shadow, clearly trying to remain unseen. Garrett drew his gun and moved silently toward the intruder. Hold it right there, he called out, his voice cutting through the evening quiet. The figure froze, then bolted toward the trees. Garrett fired a warning shot into the air, causing the intruder to stumble. Before the man could recover, Garrett was on him, tackling him to the ground. The cabin door flew open, and Lillian appeared with a shotgun in her hands. Garrett. "What's happening? Stay back," he shouted, struggling with the intruder. The man beneath him was wiry and strong, fighting with the desperation of someone with nothing to lose. He landed a solid punch to Garrett's jaw, momentarily stunning him. The intruder scrambled to his feet, but before he could run, the blast of a shotgun tore through the night air. Lillian stood firm, the shotgun now aimed at the ground where she'd fired a warning shot. "The next one won't miss," she said with remarkable steadiness. The intruder raised his hands slowly. In the moonlight, Garrett could see a young face, perhaps no more than 20 years old, dirty and gaunt with hunger. "Who are you?" Garrett demanded, getting to his feet and keeping his revolver trained on the young man. "Name's Jimmy Wilson," the intruder replied, his voice shaking. "I wasn't going to hurt nobody, just looking for food." Lillian lowered the shotgun slightly. "You could have knocked on the door and asked." Jimmy's eyes darted between them nervously. "People ain't exactly welcoming to strangers these days." "Where are you from?" Garrett asked, still suspicious. "Colorado, originally, been drifting, looking for work." Something about the young man's story didn't quite add up, but he didn't seem dangerous, just desperate. "When's the last time you ate?" Lillian asked, her tone softening. Jimmy shrugged. "Had some jerky yesterday." Lillian glanced at Garrett, a silent question in her eyes. He gave a reluctant nod. "Come inside," she said to Jimmy. "I'll feed you, but Mr. Hayes will be keeping his gun handy, so don't try anything foolish." Inside the cabin, Lillian warmed up a pot of stew while Garrett watched Jimmy carefully. The young man devoured the food when it was placed before him, confirming that he was indeed half-starved. "Now," Garrett said when Jimmy had finished eating, "why don't you tell us what you're really doing here?" Jimmy wiped his mouth with the back of his hand. "I told you I was hungry. There are other homesteads closer to town," Garrett interrupted. "You came here specifically." Jimmy's shoulders slumped. "I heard there might be work. Someone in town mentioned the Lawson place needed help since the old man died." "Who told you that?" Lillian asked sharply. "Some fellas in the saloon said they knew the owner was looking for a hand." Garrett and Lillian exchanged concerned glances. No one in town should have been saying any such thing. "Did these men give you their names?" Garrett pressed. Jimmy shook his head. "No, but they were buying drinks for everyone. One had a scar across his cheek right here." He traced a line from his left eye to his jaw. Garrett's expression darkened. "Did they mention gold?" Jimmy's eyes widened slightly enough to confirm Garrett's suspicion. "They might have said something about the hills around here being promising." "They sent you to scout the property," Garrett concluded grimly. "I swear, I didn't know they were planning anything bad," Jimmy protested. "They just offered me $5 to check if anyone was living here regularly." "These men," Lillian said quietly, "did they mention killing my father?" Jimmy paled. "No, madam, I wouldn't have taken their money if they had." "But you didn't ask why they wanted to know about an apparently abandoned homestead." Garrett's tone was skeptical. "Out here, a man learns not to ask too many questions," Jimmy replied, "especially when he's hungry." Garrett stood up abruptly. "We're going to town. Sheriff Miller needs to hear about this." "Now?" Lillian asked, glancing outside at the darkening sky. "Now, those men are back and they're still after your father's land. It's not safe for you to stay here tonight." "I ain't going to no sheriff," Jimmy said, standing as well. "I didn't do nothing wrong." Garrett leveled a hard stare at him. "You were trespassing, for starters, and you took money from men who likely murdered Thomas Lawson. Your choice is simple. Come with us to the sheriff voluntarily, or I'll take you there myself." Seeing the determination in Garrett's eyes, Jimmy reluctantly agreed. The three of them rode to Silver Creek, reaching the sheriff's office just as Miller was preparing to close up for the night. The sheriff listened intently as Garrett explained the situation, with Jimmy reluctantly filling in details about the men who had hired him. "Scar-faced man sounds like Jeb Harker," Miller said thoughtfully. "He's a known troublemaker, been suspected of claim jumping before. Never could pin anything on him, though. And now he's back, sending scouts to Lillian's property. Garrett said grimly. Miller nodded. I'll send telegrams to neighboring towns, see if anyone's spotted Harker and his gang. In the meantime, he turned to Jimmy, you'll be staying as my guest until we sort this out. Jimmy looked dismayed but didn't protest as the sheriff led him to a cell. What about Miss Lawson? Garrett asked. It's not safe for her to stay at her father's place. I agree, Miller said. Miss Lawson, I'd advise you to remain at Garrett's ranch until we apprehend these men. Lillian, who had been uncharacteristically quiet, finally spoke. I won't be driven from my father's land by the same men who killed him. No one's suggesting you give up the land, Garrett said gently. Just that you stay somewhere safer until the threat is gone. And how long will that be? She challenged. Weeks, months, years? I can't hide forever, Garrett. Just until we catch Harker and his gang, Miller interjected. I'll deputize some men tomorrow, organize a search of the area. Lillian still looked unconvinced, but she nodded reluctantly. Very well, but I'll continue going to my father's property during the day. I won't abandon it. Not alone, you won't, Garrett insisted. Then you'll have to accompany me, she replied with a hint of defiance. Because I will not neglect my responsibilities. The ride back to Garrett's ranch was tense, both of them lost in their own thoughts. The moon had risen, casting long shadows across the landscape and giving everything a silvery, otherworldly appearance. I'm sorry for being difficult, Lillian said suddenly, breaking the silence. I know you're only trying to protect me. Garrett glanced at her, her profile illuminated by moonlight. You're not being difficult. You're being brave. There's a difference. Is it bravery or stubbornness? She asked with a rueful smile. Maybe a bit of both, he admitted. But I admire it. Most people would have packed up and headed back east after what you've been through. I considered it, she confessed. The first night after you told me about my father, it seemed the sensible thing to do. But then I thought about how much he loved this land, how he spoke about it in his letters. I couldn't abandon his dream. They rode in companionable silence for a while longer, the only sounds the steady hoofbeats of their horses and the occasional night bird. Garrett, Lillian said softly as they approached his ranch, thank you. Not just for tonight, but for everything. I don't know what I would have done without your help these past weeks. You'd have managed, he replied, surprised by the confidence in his own voice. You're stronger than you know, Lillian. Their eyes met in the moonlight, and something passed between them, a current of understanding, of mutual respect, and perhaps something more. Garrett looked away first, uncomfortable with the sudden intimacy of the moment. We should get some rest, he said gruffly. Tomorrow might be a long day. The next morning, Sheriff Miller rode out to Garrett's ranch with news. One of his deputies had spotted men matching the description of Harker, and his gang camped in the hills about 10 miles north. They're not making any secret of their presence, Miller reported as they stood in Garrett's yard, which means either they're not worried about the law or they're setting a trap. Or both, Garrett suggested grimly. I've gathered a posse. We're riding out this afternoon. I'm coming with you, Garrett said immediately. Miller nodded, having expected this. I figured as much. We could use a good shot like you if things get dicey. What about me? Lillian asked, joining them from the porch where she'd been listening. You'll stay here, Garrett and Miller said simultaneously. Lillian crossed her arms. If these men are after my property, I have a right to be there when they're confronted. Miss Lawson, Miller said gently, these are dangerous men who have already killed once. I can't risk a civilian's safety, especially a lady's. He's right, Lillian, Garrett added. The best thing you can do is stay here where it's safe. Though clearly unhappy with the decision, Lillian reluctantly agreed. Garrett left her in the care of Mrs. Potts and his foreman, Hank, with strict instructions not to let her out of their sight. The posse rode out that afternoon, 6 men including Garrett and Sheriff Miller. They approached the area where the gang had been spotted cautiously, aware that they might be riding into an ambush. The camp was deserted when they found it, though the ashes of the fire were still warm. The gang couldn't have left more than an hour or two earlier. They're heading south, one of the deputies noted, examining the tracks, toward Silver Creek. Or the Lawson place, Garrett realized with a sudden chill. They could be planning to jump the claim while we're out looking for them. Miller's expression hardened. Let's ride. They pushed their horses hard, racing back toward the settled areas. As they neared the junction where the trail split one fork leading to Silver Creek, the other to the Lawson homestead, they heard gunshots in the distance. "That's coming from my ranch," Garrett said, his heart racing with sudden fear. "Lillian." Without waiting for the others, he spurred his horse forward, galloping toward home with a desperate urgency. The others followed close behind, guns drawn and ready. As Garrett's property came into view, he saw 3 horses tethered outside the small cabin where Lillian had been staying. Smoke rose from one corner of the roof. They had set it on fire. A shot rang out from the main house, where Hank was returning fire from a window. From her cabin, Garrett could hear the distinctive boom of Thomas Lawson's shotgun. Lillian was fighting back. Garrett and the posse charged into the yard, taking the gang by surprise. 2 men were trying to force their way into Lillian's cabin, while a third provided covering fire from behind a water trough. "Sheriff's posse, drop your weapons," Miller shouted as they thundered into the yard. Instead of surrendering, the men opened fire on the newcomers. Garrett dove from his horse as bullets whizzed past, taking cover behind the well. He returned fire, aiming at the man behind the water trough. His shot found its mark and the man fell. The other 2 were caught in the open, pinned down by fire from both the posse and the defenders in the houses. One raised his hands in surrender, while the other made a desperate dash for the horses. "Harker," Miller called out, recognizing the fleeing man as the leader of the gang. Garrett took careful aim and fired, hitting Harker in the leg. The outlaw stumbled but managed to reach his horse and swung into the saddle. Before he could ride away, another shot rang out, this one from Lillian's cabin. Harker clutched his shoulder, then toppled from the horse. The firefight was over as quickly as it had begun. Miller and his deputies secured the surviving gang members while Garrett ran to Lillian's cabin. The fire was spreading, consuming the dry wood quickly. "Lillian." He shouted, approaching the door cautiously in case she mistook him for one of the attackers. The door flew open and Lillian emerged, shotgun still in hand, her face smudged with soot but otherwise unharmed. "Garrett," she exclaimed, the relief in her voice palpable. She lowered the shotgun and, to his surprise, threw herself into his arms. He held her tightly, his heart hammering in his chest from the exertion of the fight, he told himself, not from the feel of her in his arms. "Are you hurt?" he asked, pulling back to examine her. She shook her head. "No, but they set fire to the cabin. Mrs. Potts is in the main house with Hank. I should check on them." Together they hurried to the main house, where they found Hank nursing a graze on his arm and Mrs. Potts fussing over him despite her own obvious terror. "Those scoundrels came looking for Miss Lawson," Hank explained. "Said something about her having a map to her father's gold claim." Lillian frowned. "A map? I don't have any map." "They seemed mighty convinced you did," Hank replied. "Said your father must have hidden it somewhere on his property, and they figured you'd found it by now." "That's why they were watching the place," Garrett realized. "They thought you were searching for gold." Sheriff Miller joined them, having secured the prisoners. Harker admitted as much. Said Thomas Lawson had been seen panning gold from a creek on his property, and word was he'd found a rich vein somewhere in the hills. "If my father found gold, he never told me about it," Lillian said. "And I've never seen any map," Miller shrugged. "Could be just rumors." Gold makes men do crazy things, whether it's real or not. The fire in Lillian's cabin was eventually extinguished, though the structure was badly damaged. Garrett insisted she move into the main house temporarily, giving her his mother's old room while he slept in the small study downstairs. That evening, after the excitement had died down and Miller had taken the prisoners to town, Garrett and Lillian sat on the porch, watching the stars emerge in the darkening sky. "I'm sorry about your cabin," Garrett said. "I'll help you rebuild it. Thank you," she replied softly. Then, after a pause, "I was thinking, perhaps I should look for a place in town. With the school starting soon, it would be more convenient." Garrett felt an unexpected pang at the thought of her leaving. "You're welcome to stay here as long as you need." "You've done more than enough already, Garrett, more than my father could have asked of you." "I don't mind," he said simply. Lillian turned to study his face in the fading light. "Why did you make that promise to my father? You barely knew me." Garrett considered the question. "Thomas was a good man. He helped me when I first came to Montana, showed me the ropes. When he asked me to look after you, it seemed the least I could do to repay him. And now, is it still just about repaying a debt? The directness of her question caught him off guard. Garrett wasn't a man accustomed to examining his feelings, let alone discussing them. No, he admitted finally, it's not just about the promise anymore. Something softened in Lillian's expression. What is it about then? Garrett struggled to find the words. I respect you, Lillian. Your strength, your determination, the way you've faced everything that's happened without breaking. Is respect all you feel? She pressed gently. He met her gaze, finding himself unable to look away. No, he said quietly, it's not all. The admission hung between them, changing the atmosphere subtly but unmistakably. Lillian reached out slowly and placed her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair. I've grown quite fond of you two, Garrett Hayes, she said with a small smile. Before he could respond, Hank called from inside the house that supper was ready, breaking the moment. But as they rose to go inside, Garrett knew that something fundamental had shifted between them. The following weeks brought changes to both their lives. Lillian began teaching at the new Silver Creek School, quickly becoming a beloved figure among the children and their parents. Garrett helped her repair the damage to her father's cabin, though she continued to stay at his ranch, her presence there becoming less temporary with each passing day. They fell into a comfortable routine. Garrett would drive her to town in the mornings for school, then pick her up in the afternoons. Sometimes they would visit her father's homestead to tend to the animals and garden. In the evenings, they would sit on the porch, talking about their days or simply enjoying each other's company in comfortable silence. One Saturday in late September, Garrett suggested they pack a picnic and ride to a beautiful spot he knew, a small lake nestled in the hills not far from his property. It's my favorite place, he told her as they set out that morning, especially in autumn when the leaves are changing. The day was perfect for a ride, crisp and clear with a hint of the coming winter in the air. Lillian wore a practical riding outfit that Garrett had come to admire. It suited her far better than the formal dresses she'd arrived in from Boston. They reached the lake just before noon. It was indeed beautiful, surrounded by aspens whose leaves had turned golden in the autumn chill, their reflection shimmering on the water's surface. It's breathtaking, Lillian said as Garrett helped her dismount. They spread a blanket near the shore and unpacked the food Mrs. Potts had prepared for them. As they ate, Garrett found himself watching Lillian more than the scenery. The sunlight caught in her hair, bringing out highlights of gold that matched the aspen leaves. She had changed since her arrival in Montana. Her skin was more tanned, her manner more relaxed and confident. You're staring, she observed with amusement. Just thinking about how much you've changed since you arrived, he admitted. For the better, I hope, definitely. He hesitated, then added, You belong here now, you've made a place for yourself. Lillian smiled softly. I feel that way too. I never expected to, especially after what happened to my father, but now I can't imagine being anywhere else. After they finished eating, they walked along the shore, skipping stones across the water's surface. Garrett found himself telling Lillian stories about his childhood, about his dreams for his ranch, things he rarely discussed with anyone. I want to expand, he explained as they paused to watch a deer drinking at the lake's edge. Buy more land, raise more cattle, maybe try breeding horses too. That sounds wonderful, Lillian said sincerely. You have a good eye for horses. My father taught me. He was a cavalry officer before he took up ranching. And what about a family? Lillian asked, her tone deliberately casual. Does that feature in your plans for the future? Garrett felt his heart rate quicken. I hadn't given it much thought, he said carefully, until recently. Their eyes met, and Garrett knew it was time to speak the words that had been growing in his heart for weeks. Lillian, he began, taking her hand in his, when I made that promise to your father, I had no idea how much you would come to mean to me. I admire you more than any woman I've ever known. Your courage, your kindness, your determination. Garrett, she started, but he gently placed a finger over her lips. Please, let me finish. I'm not good with words, and if I stop now, I might lose my nerve. He took a deep breath. What I'm trying to say is, I love you, Lillian Lawson. I think I started falling in love with you the moment you stepped down from that stagecoach and faced the news of your father's death with such dignity. And every day since, I've found more reasons to love you." Tears glistened in Lillian's eyes, but she was smiling. "Oh, Garrett," she said softly, "for a man who claims not to be good with words, you've chosen them perfectly. Does that mean?" He left the question unfinished, suddenly uncertain. In answer, Lillian stepped closer, placing her hand on his cheek. "It means I love you too, Garrett Hayes." "I think I have for some time now." Relief and joy flooded through him. Slowly, giving her time to pull away if she wished, Garrett leaned down and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was gentle at first, tentative, but deepened as Lillian responded, her arms sliding around his neck. When they finally parted, both slightly breathless, Garrett rested his forehead against hers. "I never expected this when I made that promise to your father. Nor did I when I came west," Lillian admitted with a small laugh, "but I'm very glad it happened." They stayed by the lake until the sun began to sink toward the horizon, talking about their feelings, their hopes, their future. As they rode back to the ranch, Garrett felt a contentment he had never known before. What had begun as a solemn promise to a dying friend had blossomed into something beautiful and unexpected, a love that would endure through all the challenges the frontier might bring. 2 weeks later, on a crisp October morning, Garrett and Lillian stood hand in hand before the preacher in Silver Creek's small church. The building was filled to capacity with well-wishers, Garrett's ranch hands, Lillian's students and their parents, and various townspeople who had come to respect both the rancher and the schoolteacher. Sheriff Miller was there, looking uncomfortable in his Sunday best, but beaming with genuine happiness for the couple. Mrs. Potts dabbed at her eyes throughout the ceremony, declaring to anyone who would listen that she'd known all along the two were perfect for each other. Garrett had never been happier or more nervous than when he slipped the simple gold band onto Lillian's finger. The ring had been his mother's, and as Lillian looked up at him with love shining in her eyes, he knew his mother would have approved of his choice. "I now pronounce you man and wife," the preacher declared. "You may kiss your bride." Garrett didn't hesitate, drawing Lillian into his arms and kissing her with all the love in his heart. The church erupted in cheers and applause. The celebration afterward was held at Garrett's, now their ranch, with tables set up in the yard and lanterns hung from the trees. There was music and dancing, food and laughter, as the community celebrated not just a wedding but the union of two people who had come to represent the best of what the Montana Territory could be. As the evening wore on, Garrett found himself sitting on the porch steps with his new wife, watching their guests enjoy the festivities. "Happy?" he asked, his arm around her waist. Lillian leaned her head against his shoulder. "Completely, you." "More than I ever thought possible," he replied honestly. They sat in comfortable silence for a moment, then Lillian said, "I've been thinking about my father's land." "Oh," Garrett tried to keep his tone neutral, unsure where this was leading. "I think we should combine our properties," she said. "Your expertise with ranching, my father's land with its water access, together they'd make an even more successful operation." Garrett smiled. "I like the way you think, Mrs. Hayes." "And the cabin could be a perfect place for the foreman," she continued. "Hank mentioned he's been wanting a place of his own. You've thought this through, haven't you?" "I have," she admitted. "Just as I've thought about where we might build a proper house for ourselves eventually. Something bigger for when our family grows." Garrett's heart swelled at the implication. "Our family?" Lillian turned to face him, a mixture of nervousness and joy in her expression. "Yes, our family, which, if my calculations are correct, will be growing in about 7 months." For a moment, Garrett could only stare at her in stunned silence. Then, as her words sank in, a grin spread across his face. Without warning, he stood, lifting Lillian into his arms and spinning her around, heedless of the curious glances from their guests. "Garrett." She laughed, clinging to his shoulders. "Put me down," he complied, but kept his arms around her. "A baby," he said wonderingly. "Are you certain?" "As certain as I can be," she replied. "I've been feeling different, and I'm late." "We're going to be parents," he marveled, placing a gentle hand on her still flat stomach. "Your father would be so proud." "He would," Lillian agreed, her eyes misting slightly. I think he knew, not about the baby, obviously, but about us. I think he hoped we would come to care for each other. He was a wise man, Garrett said softly. I wish he could be here to see this. In a way, he is, Lillian replied. His love for this land, for me, it's part of what brought us together. They rejoined the celebration, their joy now compounded by their secret. Later that night, after the guests had departed and they were finally alone as husband and wife, Garrett held Lillian close in the darkness of their bedroom. I never imagined this is where that promise would lead, he murmured against her hair. When your father asked me to watch over you, I thought it would be a burden. And now, Lillian asked, her hand resting over his heart. Now I know it was the greatest gift I've ever received, he replied sincerely. I get to spend my life with you, raise a family with you, build something lasting together. I love you, Garrett Hayes, Lillian whispered. And I love you, Lillian Hayes, he responded. More than I'll ever be able to say. In the years that followed, their love only deepened. Their son Thomas, named for Lillian's father, was born the following spring, a strong, healthy boy with his mother's green eyes and his father's determined chin. 2 years later, he was joined by a sister, Grace, who took after her father in temperament but had her mother's gentle heart. The ranch prospered under their combined care. Garrett's expertise with cattle and Lillian's careful management of their finances allowed them to expand, buying neighboring properties when they became available. They built a new house, larger and more comfortable than the original, but kept the old one standing as a reminder of where their journey together had begun. Lillian continued teaching until their children were born, then focused on raising them and helping with the ranch. But she never abandoned her commitment to education, teaching her own children, and often holding informal classes for the children of their ranch hands. On the 10th anniversary of their wedding, Garrett surprised Lillian by taking her back to the lake where he had first declared his love. They picnicked on the shore, watching their children play at the water's edge under the watchful eye of Mrs. Potts, who had remained with them all these years. Are you happy with how things turned out? Garrett asked, taking Lillian's hand in his. Do you ever miss Boston or regret coming west? Lillian shook her head without hesitation. Never. Everything I love is here, our children, our home. I can't imagine any other life, even with all the hardships, he pressed. Life in Montana wasn't always easy, even with their relative prosperity. Even with those, she confirmed. They've made us stronger, both individually and together. As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the water, Garrett reflected on the strange and wonderful path that had led him here. A promise made to a dying man had changed the course of his life in ways he could never have anticipated. What had begun as a duty had transformed into the deepest love he had ever known. What are you thinking about? Lillian asked, noticing his thoughtful expression. About promises, he replied. And how keeping one promise to your father led to all the other promises we've made to each other over the years. The best promises, she said softly. The best promises, he agreed, drawing her close and kissing her gently as their children's laughter echoed across the water, a testament to the love that had grown from an unexpected beginning into the greatest blessing of their lives.